in 90 seconds, talk about the office you're seeking, and then answer the following question, which is being put to all candidates. Want to make sure we give everybody the same attention. What do you think are the most important solutions at the federal level to address sea level rise and flooding?
My name is Dave Cummings. I'm here for Congressional Seat District 18. First of all, thank you, Michael, for having this, hosting this, and also all the organizations who are a part of this. The first thing which is kind of, I have to state, which is the obvious thing, which is the fact that I'm the only candidate here. I think that speaks volumes. In order to address any issue, the first thing you have to do is show up. I think we can all agree on that. Going forward, what are some things that we can do at the federal level? Well, first of all, is we can support our state and local folks with funding. We also have scientific and engineering organizations, and also, for instance, Army Corps of Engineers, FEMA, and some of these organizations that we can lend to assist in the evaluation of and priorities that we can address firsthand. So those are some of the initial things that the federal government can do at the state level is support those efforts. But it first, of course, starts with showing up and being a part of this kind of format. So.
Talk about your background and what you consider a personal or professional accomplishment regarding sea level rise, the environment, energy, conservation, or sustainability. Or do you, like other candidates, candidly concede that you've got a big learning curve on all of those topics? But tackle that question as our organizers spelled it out.
Sure. One of the businesses I own, I'm a licensed insurance adjuster. Catastrophe is my specialization, so I'm all lines, not only here in the state of Florida, but also 15 states throughout the country. And also I operate in states that don't require a license. So this uniquely qualifies me to address some of these issues. I've actually seen firsthand ecological disasters, man-made disasters, and these kinds of things. And then, of course, naturally, how the government, FEMA, and some of the insurance companies, how it all ties in, and the ultimate impact to the local population. And so it's extremely important to understand those variable components to be able to address some of these issues. So I think uniquely, that is the one thing that I bring to the table that gives me an advantage, and perhaps maybe that is why the other folks aren't here, is they just don't know how to speak to it.
Do you believe that human activity is definitively impacting our climate and is a contributory factor to sea level rise?
Thank you. 100% people do impact our environment. The question that always consistently comes up from left or right is to what degree? And I think it's important that, one of the gentlemen mentioned, that we continue to study this effect.
What degree do you think it is from all you've learned, all the experts you've talked to,
Sure.
your sense?
One of the benefits that I have growing up in the state, I'm a Florida native. I was born here, raised in the Treasure Coast. There are other factors beyond just simply climate change that have had a catastrophic effect. I'll talk about a couple if I have a few minutes.
A minute per answer,
okay,
according
sure.
to our organizers.
All right, so Lake Okeechobee, for instance, used to be much larger, and then as we kind of capped it, we put a levee around it, and then we built canals out to the left and right. This was to manage water going out to east and west instead of flowing south. The purpose for that was really a pocketbook decision to help development. And so what happened is all that land south then got developed. Now, it's important to understand it was never raised. It wasn't raised, it was just developed. And so now what happens is when we have these heavy rains that show up, and we have some of these other things that show up, you literally have a massive basin that exists. And so that has nothing to do necessarily with sea level rise, but it has everything to do with a man-made problem. So that's just this one issue.
Let's speak to the sea level rise aspect of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of any accomplishments you've had. And moreover, if you go to Congress as a Republican, I know it's nonpartisan, but the question has to be asked.
Yeah.
You have a president who's called climate change a hoax. You heard the poll I mentioned earlier where there's a polarizing divide about whether climate change is being exaggerated. Would you stand in front of the president and say to him, climate change is not a hoax, we need to deal with it? Because the leader of your party says it's a hoax. 69% of Republicans recently polled say it's being exaggerated. How can you be a representative for people bringing their environmental concerns to this forum if you're having to deal with that kind of pushback in your own party, and how would you do it?
Great question. So it's
Specifically, how would you do it?
right. It's important that when you go to attack any problem, you must come with information. You must come with facts. The way that you do that is not come with facts from one slighted organization or another slighted organization. So what I would do in this case is I would say, okay, these are things from the National, Oceanographic Atlantic, NOAA is what I'm trying to say, and to go to the table and say, these are some studies that have been conducted, and these are some findings that we have. And then when you go back to them and you say, okay, well, here's another study, and with information from nonpartisan sources, then whether the person wants to accept the information or not is really in their, the ball is in their court at that stage.
Simply put, is the president wrong when he says climate change is a hoax? Yes or no?
I would say yes to a degree. And let me make sure it's clear on that. I think that none of us understand to what degree climate change is affected. So I wouldn't call it a hoax, but I would say it's an issue that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be studied more from nonpartisan, non-polarized scientific research.
I want to get to a few audience questions, but also a few more of the questions that our organizers have thought important for congressional candidates. The majority of funding they ask from the federal government can only spend after an area is hit by a disaster. For example, they say FEMA spends less than 1% of its budget on pre-disaster mitigation, and the Stafford Act provides federal funding only after an area is hit. Would you want to change the policies to encourage more spending to mitigate pre-disaster, and if so, how?
100%. The Stafford Act, as you mentioned, it's a back-end problem. It's after the disaster has happened, and there's kind of the old saying, it says an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If we can come on the front side of problems, identify some ways through our engineering groups that we can prevent some of these disasters from happening, then we're not having to spend money on the backside to solve the problem. Classic example, some other low-lying areas, like I talked about how we're in a low-lying area that's, just a bucket. We all remember Katrina. What was the failure there? We had a levee that was not ready to be addressed with a hurricane of such significance. And had we solved that problem on the front end and reinforced that levee there, we would not have had the tremendous loss of life and property that happened later. So definitely want to be on the front end of things.
Briefly on this one, just as the other candidates asked for a very brief response, the federal drilling plan currently still includes Florida. You've heard about Floridians having a chance to say no to nearshore drilling. If it continues to include Florida, would you support or oppose it? Bottom line, do you support offshore drilling in Florida?
I think absolutely I would ban drilling. And the reason why is the number one economy in Florida is tourism. And the number one driver of that tourism is the water. And I think we're already seeing some of the catastrophic effects from the Lake Okeechobee discharges and what that's having on the Fort Myers side and on our side. So if you can imagine having an oil spill like BP, it's something that we just would never be able to recover from. So I'm against it.
Question for you, because Congress is dealing with this right now. The summer algae blooms, which we see having such an effect on our Treasure Coast constituents. Some of you may be down here from the Treasure Coast dealing with it firsthand. I see some heads nodding. Once again, threatens the economy and threatens environment, health, the tourism industry, the health of our freshwater lakes, canals, beaches. The Florida legislature has been trying to deal with the issue for several years now. Our organizers ask that at the federal level, what sort of solutions would you support or propose if elected?
Thank you for asking. I have an actual plan. If you go to davecummings.org, I talk about it. If you go to YouTube, there's going to be a video coming up that specifically lays out the plan, Dave Cummings on YouTube. It'll be within the next week. So we have a fantastic plan where Lake Okeechobee goes across to our areas through the C-44 canal is the primary place where it dumps into our estuary. So what the goal is would be to simply, we can't capture all of the runoff. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the choke point right where C-44 canal dumps into our estuary. And what I'm advocating is to put a temporary solution first in place, something called geotubes, which are an EPA-approved, almost like a giant fish tank filter that would catch this algae before it goes into the waterway, and then to have a more permanent solution like a desalinization plant put right there so that once the discharge comes, it's caught right there, it's clean, and then we have clean water going into the estuary.
Because we're trying to be fair on time and we have one candidate, it will seem like this is a much shorter segment because we don't have 6 people here. I do want to get to 2 of the audience questions which happen not surprisingly, to tie into questions our organizers have put together about renewable energy. One audience participant says, renewable energy, specifically solar energy, what can we do to increase our solar capacity? So that's part one of that, and our organizers said, how does renewable energy relate to sea level rise, and what can be done, as our audience participant says, to promote renewable energy? So answer that question for us.
There's two things that we have plenty of here in Florida. One is sunshine, and the other is water. So I think we need to do a better job at capturing both. Solar still has a little bit of a learning curve. There's been a lot of federal money that's gone towards the development of solar. The last 8 years, the prior administration, there was an incredible amount of money that went towards developing solar, and I didn't see the results that we wanted yet, but it doesn't mean we should stop. But I do think one thing that we can get a little more bang for our buck out of, and FAU is doing some of these studies, is to use our natural ebb and flow of our tides and our waterways to generate geothermal type of energy. And this is happening around the world in other places. And essentially what it is just capturing that energy that comes from the flow of the ocean.
Some are trying that in the Gulf Stream, although there are environmental concerns for marine life.
Right,
but it is one suggestion.
It would have to be done correctly, yeah.
Somebody else asked, and again it was a question that we'd like to put to you. We see it time and again, low-income residents, they ask, frequently disproportionately impacted by hurricanes. How can Congress address recovery assistance to low-income residents? And that ties into what one audience participant said, how should we make our affordable housing more resilient and protect vulnerable populations from sea level rise impacts?
Such a great question. If we look at some of these areas that have been affected the most, you do see a lot of these lower economic LMI, low to moderate income areas. Fort Pierce took a big hit after Irma. I think in particular that there needs to be federal funds designed specifically to address LMI areas. The difference between that, for instance, in the Keys, which was also hit terribly hard, is those are folks who have the dollars. And so when you have some of these impacts that happen, you have to have, that is why we pay taxes, right? This is the purpose for paying taxes, is so that when we have some catastrophic event like this, we can take care of our weakest, we can take care of our poorest, we can take care of the folks that need it the most.
Last question from our participants, and one I'll throw in too. If you'd been in the House at the time, would you have said, Mr. President, sign the Paris Climate Agreement? Yes or no?
I would say I would have told him to sign it simply because if you've reviewed it, a lot of folks have taken the polarization out of it. The United States was putting out everything, and the other countries, like it was referenced here, China and some of these other folks, were not coming to the table to address it.
And that ties into a question from our organizers, our last one for you. At the national level, how do you think the U.S. should address the root causes of sea level rise and warming? Are there specific solutions, such as international agreements, carbon fees and dividends, innovative tech incentives, or other measures that you would champion as representative in this vulnerable peninsula we all call home?
I'm going to focus more on our state because that, I think, is where my heart is when I address the question. I think that there are several things that we can do from an infrastructure standpoint. We've heard some of them tonight, but I'm going to kind of stage it out for us. So one is we need artificial reefs on the offshore. A lot of these sea level rises that we're experiencing may not have to do necessarily with climate change, but when you have multiple massive storms come and restructure the sandbars that used to create barriers, we have to rebuild those. And so these offshore barrier systems, like what has happened in Fort Pierce, is a great example as you come into our ports. And if you notice the areas like Miami that get hit the worst on the flooding is because they don't necessarily have these barriers that we have, barrier islands, for instance, that we have up here. So I think that's the first thing we have to do is restructure artificially. Second thing is as we come closer to shore, we need to bump up our infrastructure and create seawalls that are sustainable and higher. We also need to probably retrofit some of our buildings as they're getting older and to bring them off the ground. The ironic thing, if you go to downtown Fort Pierce, you're going to notice almost all of the homes are much higher off the ground. And this is because these folks understood this back in 1945. They understood there was water that was coming in and out. So some retrofitting there. One of the other things I mentioned earlier are the geotubes that we can put on the beaches that retain sand and prevent this $21 million, $23 million to replenish our beach when it gets washed out.
Sir, we know it's brief. We know it can only give a flavor of some of your viewpoints, but we appreciate it. It's important. We thank you for your time, and thank you for being here today. How about a big round of applause for our congressional candidate, District 18.